Hello everyone. I'm going to explain briefly the structure of a COVID-19 model that we developed step by step as is shown in the next slide. We start with the standard epidemic model, which is quite standard in the literature of system dynamics. Then we add two feedback loops from death rate to the behavior of people, how people behave as they observe and perceive the death rate. Then we have hospital availability. In the communities that hospital capacity is not adequate, people who cannot get to hospital, that will affect the death rate and recovery rate. So we capture hospital availability for those societies. Then we add quarantine. Symptomatic patient might go to quarantine to decrease their contacts with the susceptible. So that is another part of the structure. Fatigue and frustration is added as people keep their social distancing and decrease number of contacts. They become tired and frustrated of not meeting other people, and as a result of frustration, they might relax their constraint and meet friends and families. Lockdown by government, if the situation gets very critical, some governments interfere and force lockdown and to prevent the spread of disease. Then we add testing and separation of asymptomatic patients from who do not have any symptoms but are infected from the rest of the population, and we examine the impact of that. And at the end, we implement vaccination. And then when we put all these pieces together, we come to the complete model. The standard or basic structure of the model is shown here. We have susceptible population in the model is about 80 million persons. Through incidence rate, they go to asymptomatic, infected asymptomatic patients, and then as symptoms appear, they go to infected symptomatic, and those who are symptomatic either recover, go to recovered population, or die. Those who are recovered after a period of time might lose their immunity and go back to susceptible group. And the incidence rate is a function of number of susceptible and infected people and the number of contacts that they have daily, and also infectivity. What is the possibility of getting infection in each time that susceptible meets an infected person? But as death rate, as people get infected and death rate goes up, death rate is perceived by people, and perceived people would affect the behavior of people in two channels. One is people would decrease the number of contacts, per day, so keep social distancing and to protect themselves from potential infected persons. And also, they affect the way that they behave in terms of hygiene behavior. They try to put on masks, try to wash their hands more frequently, don't touch many surfaces in order to increase infectivity, to decrease infectivity and protect themselves. So number of contacts per day plus infectivity would determine incidence rate, and those two positive loops would increase death rate, while these two negative loops would control death rate through the way that people would behave in reaction to increasing death rate. Then we add hospital availability. In some societies, that hospital capacity is not enough for all patients. When number of symptomatic increases and goes up, hospital availability would decrease. Hospital availability would impact the recovery rate and death rate. When hospital is not available for all patients, recovery rate would decrease and death rate would rise. And therefore, hospital availability would become an important issue in those societies without enough hospital beds. Then we have quarantine. Infected symptomatic people might go to quarantine and separate themselves from the rest of population. And as they go to quarantine, the number of infected who meet susceptible would decrease, and therefore incidence would decrease or would even have some impact on incidence rate. After that, we add fatigue and frustration. As people keep their social distancing for a long time and don't meet their friends, families, and others, they might get tired and frustrated from being isolated. Those frustration might cause relaxing the separation from others and would increase the number of contacts, which will then increase incidence rate. So frustration and fatigue when social distancing continues for a long time could have a negative effect and could weaken this negative feedback loops which work through number of contacts. After that, we introduce government enforcing social distancing or lockdown. When death rate increases and perceived death rate goes up and the situation becomes critical, some government intervene and enforce social distancing, and that would decrease number of contacts, which will eventually decrease incidence rate, and that is another negative loop which can control incidence rate and eventually death rate and cumulative death. Then we have testing. Some societies implement vast testing to identify asymptomatic people and put them in quarantine. We implement this in this model by setting up a testing and by identifying asymptomatic and putting them in quarantine. They become here in this stock, and either those who are in quarantine might not develop real symptoms and therefore will move to the recovered population, or if they develop some symptoms, then they move into symptomatic people who either recover or die. So by testing and putting asymptomatic patients in quarantine, the number of infected who will meet susceptible or contact susceptible would decrease, and that could have important impact on the incidence rate. We examined that in the model. Then we have the vaccine. When vaccine become available, susceptible people are divided into two groups: susceptible willing to take the vaccine or susceptible unwilling to take the vaccine. Those who are willing to take the vaccine increased demand for vaccination, and then vaccination capacity should build up and increase. Based on vaccination capacity and demand for vaccination, rate of vaccination is determined, and people willing to take the vaccine will move into vaccinated population who will not anymore get infected. Of course, we in the model we added effectiveness of the vaccine, and some of vaccinated people might get infected depending on the effectiveness of the vaccine that they take. But we have not put that detail here. So vaccinated population, after losing their immunity due to vaccination, either move back to susceptible people willing to take the vaccine, or move to susceptible unwilling to take the vaccine. And then this segment of the model interact with the rest part of the model and create the whole dynamics of the COVID-19 model that we have developed. And here is a whole structure of the model when we put everything together. Thank you for your attention. Dan is going to show you some simulation results from the model and the insight that we can get from it. Thank you.
In the first part of this presentation, Ali described the workings and reasonings of the model. I'd like to show you some of the results that it has yielded. We're going to focus on one output variable, probably the most important one, the incidence rate, that is, the number of new infections per day that occur in our hypothetical population. The base behavior is just what you'd expect from a classic SEIR epidemiologic model that partitions the population into susceptible, exposed, infected, and recovered. Infections initially climb exponentially and then decrease as the susceptible population becomes depleted. Cumulative incidence rises until the entire population has been infected. In our model, incidence never drops all the way to zero, since recovered persons' immunity wanes over time and they become susceptible to reinfection. Our first question asks, what would happen if the population responds to the perceived death rate by reducing personal contacts and instituting hygiene behaviors like masking? The higher the death rate rises above a set threshold, the greater the behavioral response. Instead of a single large wave of infections, this blue curve, which is too high to show on the screen, we get an initial peak that's suppressed as behavioral responses take over. Within a couple of months, however, the behavioral responses wane as death rate drops and stays low. This allows a new wave of infections to commence, and the cycle starts over, producing repeated waves of infections. We now introduce a testing program that tests all asymptomatic persons frequently and puts them into isolation, in other words, quarantine, for the duration of their illness. Testing clearly lowers the height of the first peak, but its effect on the following waves is less clear. Let's look at this over a longer period of time. A longer look seems to show counterintuitive results. At 2 years out, the peaks under the testing program are much higher than in the behavior-only scenario. But notice that the testing peaks are narrow. What's more, under the testing program, the incidence rate drops very low between the waves, while under the behavioral scenario, it does not. It would be useful here to compare not just the height, base, and width of the waves, but also the area under them. That is, the total number of people who are being infected. A graph of cumulative incidence shows the testing program really does reduce the number of infections over time, and reduces them by about 20%. In the next scenario, the testing program is still running, but fatigue and frustration over time reduce the intensity of people's behavioral responses. Just like in the previous slides, results may seem counterintuitive. In the frustration scenario, in red, the peaks are so much lower, and the amplitudes of the waves of infections is also smaller. But look how high the troughs are. In the fatigue frustration scenario, the incidence rate is never very high, but it also never goes down very far. And when we look at the cumulative incidence, we see that total infections over time really are increased. Up to this point in the scenarios, the behavioral response and testing have served to slow the epidemic substantially, but not to stop it. In his presentation, Ali described to you another intervention in which government or other authority mandates and enforces contact reduction and hygienic behaviors, but we're not going to show those results here. Instead, we will look at a more proactive approach to the problem, namely a vaccination program. The vaccine in our model is initially 90% effective, meaning that in the vaccinated population, it prevents 90% of the infections that would occur in a similar but unvaccinated population. 70% of our population is willing to be vaccinated, 30% are not, and therefore they remain completely susceptible. It takes a few months for the program, which is shown in red, to get going, which is why the initial wave of infections looks quite the same. Vaccine protection lasts about 9 months, after which people need to come in for revaccination. Our program tremendously reduces the number of infections, but only among the vaccinated. The unvaccinated population is still vulnerable, and infections continue, though at a relatively low level, because the large vaccinated population affords the unvaccinated a measure of protection. We could describe it as partial herd immunity. How sensitive is the vaccine program to these two parameters of vaccine effectiveness and willingness to be vaccinated? In this set of runs, we hold effectiveness at 90% and see the results for 3 levels of population willingness. High, 90%, medium, 60%, and low, 30%. At 90% willingness, that's the orange line, new infections are virtually eliminated, even among those who aren't vaccinated. At 60%, new infections are greatly reduced. The infection rate oscillates for a while and settles down into a steady state. At 30% willingness, average incidence rate is high, and substantial oscillations occur for a very long time. In the next set of tests, we hold willingness constant at 70% and vary effectiveness from a high of 90% down to a low of 10%, i.e. a vaccine which is barely effective. As we saw from the first slide in the series, at 70% willingness, even a 90% effective vaccine does not completely halt new infections. Successively lower values of effectiveness show successively higher levels of infection with much higher and somewhat more frequent peaks. The duration of the oscillations increases as effectiveness goes down, and at the lowest level, they go on indefinitely. We had only a few minutes for this little show. We hope this gave you a feel for our COVID-19 simulation model's capacities and uses. Please do contact us if you'd like to know more. Thank you.